I'm 27 male, and I read a lot of negative stories on here, and sometimes they can make it really hard to trust people. Yes, I blame the website, but it's just not because of it. It's the person itself in question. That makes it so difficult to believe. Despite his recent behavior, how much can a person really change in such a short period of time? Let me explain the reason behind my conundrum from the beginning. My father and my mother moved here from Mexico not long before giving birth to me. They both applied for citizenship while I was still very young, but unfortunately my dad was the only one to receive it. Thanks to a drunk driver and a bit of a bad timing, we lost my mother before she was able to be sworn in as a citizen. Growing up, I was often bullied in school by kids whose parents have heard my story and told their children about it. I don't know how some people think citizenship works, but they seem to have thought that my parents were some kind of criminals for having a child before their application for citizenship was completed. This got me into a lot of fights at school. I got into trouble fairly often, and I was really sensitive to people saying anything bad about my parents, partly because I never really knew my mom, but also because I saw growing up how hard my dad worked to take care of me. He never remarried, partly because he was spending too much time between work and taking care of me, to really spend much time meeting people. Children are not cheap, and we had no other family in the country, so he often had to work 2 jobs just to make sure I always had babysitters, and that there was enough food on the table, even though I rarely ever saw him eat. Things got a lot better for him when I was about 8, and my dad, Benny, Dad had been on his way home from work when he saw Benny stopped on the side of the road. All he needed was a jump start, but nobody was stopping to help him until my father came along. While my dad was helping him out, they got to talking and learned that they had a lot in common. Benny's also a single father, having lost his wife to illness, and he also had a son, Rashad, only a year older than me. And much like me, Rashad was dealing with bullies in school because he and Benny were black. They became friends, and Benny would bring Rashad over to play with me on weekends, while he and my dad worked on their cars together. Having always had to be the useful one around the house, my father was pretty good at learning to do things himself. Benny noticed early on that the cars were something my father especially excelled at, since Benny owned an auto shop as well. He offered my father a job. It wasn't a ton of money, but it was enough that Dad would not need to work 2 jobs anymore, and that was enough. As I got older, I started learning my way around a car pretty well myself. Rashad was never as interested, showing a lot more interest in criminal law. So after high school, while Rashad was working retail to help his dad pay for college, I decided to skip college and simply got a job at the auto shop myself. It was one of the best decisions I've ever made. It brought my father and me even closer together, and I truly loved the work. When I was 23 and my girlfriend, Tara, was 26, it wasn't long before I was able to save up enough so that I could get a place with her together. Moving out of my father's house was a little bittersweet, but it didn't feel like that much of a loss since we still saw each other every day. Then last year, things started getting a lot harder when Benny hired a new mechanic, Lloyd. For reference, Lloyd is the person I was talking about in the beginning of my post. Why? Well, I'll explain it. From the very start, it was pretty obvious that Lloyd did not care for me nor my dad, and I have little doubt based on some election stickers on his truck bumper that it was because we're Mexican. The very first time he saw us, he shook his head and said, "Well, that's 2 more stolen jobs." It got worse about a month in when tools started going missing from the shop. Nothing huge, just basic tools like a couple of sockets and impact drivers. Then an entire set of right grip wrenches went missing, and Benny could not ignore it anymore. They're not as expensive as some tools, but enough that he wasn't willing to accept the tools were simply lost. Benny lectured the entire staff, even the ones who never really set foot in the garage, and he demanded that anybody with information should come forward. My father and I both work with Lloyd pretty close, and the times that the tools went missing versus the last time anyone had used them made Lloyd the most likely suspect. We started watching him a bit more closely, but he did not make it easy. He would catch us in the act and snap at us saying, "Oh, so you have the energy to swim all the way here, but now y'all can't do anything but stand around and watch me work." Well, that made him seem even more suspicious, so my father finally gave in and told Benny his suspicions about Lloyd's involvement in the theft. In the end, nothing was ever proven, so Benny told Lloyd that he wouldn't lose his job as long as there were no other theft. The thefts did stop after that, so it seemed like a good bet that Lloyd really had been guilty all along. Whether he was or not, he hated us even more after that. He cornered my father in the parking lot after work, the day Benny had talked to him and accused him of trying to take another white man's job. From that day forward, he was angry all the time, to the point that it started affecting his work pretty bad. Sometimes he would be working on a car and just start slamming tools around out of nowhere, sometimes dinging the car he was working on in the process. Well, Benny would catch wind of it all and pulled Lloyd off the car, telling Lloyd to go cool off for a while and let someone else take over. That worked a few times, unless Benny specifically told either me or my father to take over. When we were the ones the boss picked, Lloyd would get so angry that Benny had to just send him home for the day. This fueled his anger and hate against us even more. A few times he was slamming around tools in our direction so that a wrench would bounce up and hit one of the cars that we were working on. My dad and I got yelled at more times by a few customers over the scratches. Lloyd, he got really antagonistic when my father started having issues with his car a few weeks ago, when the car frequently was stalling or shutting down right at the jump start. Lloyd would laugh pretty much every time my dad mentioned it and used to insult my father's ability as a mechanic. This carried on for quite a while, but things became really bad last week. One of our most loyal customers, who's been coming to us for pretty much all of her repairs and tune-ups for years, was coming in to pick her car up when she caught wind of one of Lloyd's tantrums. My father had been the one to work on the car, but even seeing another of our mechanics acting that way, it turned her off quite a lot. She told Benny that she wasn't sure that she could keep using us if he was willing to keep such a loose cannon on staff. Benny eventually calmed her down and was able to keep her business, but he was not happy about it. He told Lloyd that he would be fired if he didn't clean up his act immediately. Lloyd got mad since my dad had been the one working on the customer's car. He told me and my father, after work that day, that we were going to pay. But strangely, Lloyd was not aggressive at all the next week. But that's not to say he was friendly, per se. He was just unusually quiet, and my father and I would exchange these glances from time to time. We would just be wondering if Lloyd's next outburst was just around the corner to come. Surprisingly, though, it never came. What happened next was even more surprising. A couple of days ago, we were all getting ready to leave when my father's car started refusing to crank. It had been looking like that would happen eventually for a while, but my father has been putting it off to avoid the cost of fixing it. Lloyd was pulling his truck around to leave, and when he saw Dad getting out to check it, he immediately pulled his truck in front of my dad's car. Well, then he got out and asked if he was having trouble with the alternator. It's not surprising that Lloyd knew that. Alternator problems were the most obvious guess from the problem my dad had already been having. The surprising part was when Lloyd's offered to fix it for him. He just told my father to set some tools out by his car while he ran to use the bathroom and make a call real quick. And that's exactly what he did. Lloyd went inside and father grabbed some tools out of the garage. And then Lloyd came out to work on it. My father asked if he was sure about working late and if he wanted any money for it. But Lloyd just said that he owed us a favor after how he treated us, and that he would do his best to make sure it was working by the time that we got there the next day. With Lloyd working on the car, I gave my father a ride home. We both were a bit uneasy on the ride back, wondering if leaving the car with Lloyd was a smart idea or not. But, I would just say the fact that Lloyd had turned down my dad's offer to pay him made us both feel a little better about it, Sure enough, when I drove my dad to work the next day, we got there to find the car was running perfect. My father offered to pay Lloyd again, since he had clearly replaced the alternator, but Lloyd said it was on the house. Well, that was yesterday, guys, and Lloyd's still been completely pleasant to work with. It's looking like he really did turn over a new leaf after almost a year of hatred. It's too bad that he had to get worse before he could get better. I'd gotten scared that day he threatened me and my dad, but nothing came of it. I wonder if Benny's threat to fire him seems to have really forced him to take a harder look at himself. I guess it could happen to anybody. But can it? Lloyd seems nice. He helped us and did not even charge us. He even accepted his part behavior and tried to make up for it. All the indications that he turned a new leaf over. Yet I'm uneasy about it. Can a person really change so much in such a short period of time? What do you guys think? Has he really changed, or is there more to the truth than what meets the eye? Update number 1. Hey guys, it's me. I'm here for an update. So, I posted a couple days ago about a guy, my dad's auto shop, who seemed like he was there to teach me a great lesson about how people can change. Well, turns out it was all nothing more than a facade, and I'm sad and incredibly angry that I now have to update the story. Much like what happened not long after Lloyd started working the shop, Benny noticed that a few tools had gone missing. It was mostly just a few cross-force wrenches and not even an entire set. Even if it had been the whole set, they weren't worth half as much as the tools that had gone missing before. That's maybe why none of us really noticed until Benny came into the garage raging. It was different this time. He didn't yell at the entire staff like he had the first time. He went straight for Lloyd. This did not really surprise anyone since Lloyd had been the one that we suspected the first time. It was a little odd how calmly Lloyd walked back with Benny into his office, though, since it seemed really obvious that Benny was calling him back there to get fired. However, that's not what happened at all. After about 15 minutes, Lloyd came out of the back office looking pretty satisfied about whatever just went down. Then Benny came back into the garage with a really sad expression and called my father in. I didn't get to see it myself, but my dad told me about everything that happened next. When he got back there, Benny asked my father if he was going through any money issues. He brought up my father not replacing his alternator right away, but my dad told him that he just likes to get as much juice out of a part as he can. With how long we've known each other, he didn't think Benny would need that explained. Then Benny gets even more serious and asked my father if there was anything he wants to admit. Well, when my dad said no, Benny showed him the footage. It was footage that showed my father going into the garage, grabbing a few tools, and then walking out with them. He never goes back to bringing them in. Instead, you see him and me leaving shortly afterwards in my car. When my father asked where this came from, Benny said that Lloyd had caught it with the dash cam in his truck. It was pretty obvious what happened. Lloyd had heard about my father and having the alternator trouble and simply bid his time until he could set us up. And I say us because my father and I leaving in the same car made it look like not only my dad was stealing tools, but I was probably in on it. So, my father tried to tell Benny about what happened and how Lloyd was the one who told Dad to grab the tools. But Benny would not believe it. Since Lloyd was inside my father took them, it looked like he could not have seen it happen without the dashcam footage. Not to mention, Benny has known my father long enough not to think he would need Lloyd to replace an alternator for him. Dad tried to explain, well, that he was just happy Lloyd did something nice for once. But the evidence ultimately stacked against him. Plus, Lloyd told Benny that he did do something nice by letting my father know about him discovering the footage and giving him time to return the tools himself. Well, in the end, my dad was fired. The one thing I heard from Benny himself was that I almost lost my job. But when my father realized he could not save himself, he assured Benny that I knew nothing about the theft. Even so, Benny told me it would be best to act like there's a target on my back until this whole thing just clears. And that's what I plan on doing because I no longer have any idea what Lloyd's capable of. I always thought he was kind of dumb, but he waited to tell Benny just so it would look like he'd given my dad time to come clean. And that's terrifyingly devious. Update 2. Hey guys, it's been a little over a month since my last update about the auto shop, and things have gotten a lot worse. I should start by saying that not much has happened with Lloyd. No tools have gone missing, and Lloyd hasn't done anything to really put a target on my back. He also hasn't done anything to convince me that he's the better person he had to pretend to be. I think he knows there'd be no point because there's no way I would ever fall for it again. But he's definitely gotten comfortable being a jerk. He keeps asking how unemployment is treating my dad, and it always feels like he's gloating. He's clearly proud of himself for putting that man out of a job. To be honest, I've had a lot of troubles controlling my anger, and I wonder if that's not Lloyd's endgame. It feels just like when I used to get in fights with bullies at school who would talk trash about my parents. I know it would not do me any favors, but I keep picturing all the ways I would love to rearrange Lloyd's face with a socket wrench, and I think of a part of him wants me to try it. The whole thing makes me especially angry because things for my dad just keep getting worse. The alternator Lloyd put in the car was apparently a cheap junkyard replacement. It didn't last long. On top of that, my father's been having other issues with it and has been costly to fix. I doubt Lloyd had anything to do with it, but my father started to feel like God just isn't on his side, especially because repairing his car put him just short of paying rent on the house. My father tried to work it out with the property owners, but they were not sympathetic. He wound up getting served a 10-day notice for missing payment. My girlfriend Tara offered to get a job to help support us so that I could divert some money to help my dad. But she's been having trouble finding a job. She did get a server job at a restaurant, but it was too little too late. My father wound up getting evicted. He's now living with me and Tara for the time being. The trouble Tara had finding a job is nothing like the trouble my dad's been having. The shop is really my father's only reference, since it's the only job he's had in years and a lot of his jobs before were under the table. He'd hoped that Benny would give him a good reference, but apparently he's been telling every potential employer that my dad's a thief. I tried calling Rashad and asking him if he could talk a bit of sense into his dad. Well, that didn't go anywhere. Rashad did try talking to Benny and reminding him that the man whose jobs prospects he was interfering with was a family friend. The problem is that's why Benny is so angry in the first place. He feels like my father betrayed him. Well, I get it, but it's just so sad to see my dad come home every day from hitting the pavement with no success. He's thinking of going back to working under the table, but the very idea of it's really hurting his pride. He hated having to work as a newly minted citizen that most people associate with as an illegal. Meanwhile, Lloyd just looks a little bit happier than he can tell how frustrated I am at having to work near him. I'm thinking of finding a new job myself, just because I'm not sure what might happen if I have to keep this stupid grinning face every day. I don't want a new job, but I'm really starting to feel like I might be on the brink of doing something I'll regret. Even if, to be honest, anything I might do, that man would feel really good right now. Update number 3. It's been a week and a half since my last update, and the good news is that I've made a shot at getting my dad's job back. It started when I was talking to Tara on the phone during my lunch break at work. I was telling her that I had not talked to Benny about it yet, but that I was thinking of looking for another job. She reminded me how much trouble she had finding one and told me to stick to it. When I hung up, I turned around and saw that Lloyd had heard the whole thing. Within just a few days, more tools started to disappear from the shop. A jack here, a blowtorch there, bigger than the wrenches that had gone missing before, so they were a lot harder to miss. It took Benny no time to notice and called me into his office. He was suspicious still that my father and I have been stealing together, so he threatened to fire me if anything else disappeared. I wasn't going to take the chance. I watched Lloyd like a hawk. I also worked intentionally slowly so that I would be the last one there. Benny did a quick interview of the garage before leaving and reminded me that I would be out of a job if anything went missing before I locked up. I told him I understood. After I finished my work, I did what I had to do, and I stayed late to do it in the first place, to snoop through Benny's office until I found the employee files. See, I found Lloyd's application and took a picture of his previous jobs and references with my phone. Then I called Benny to tell him that I've been so sluggish because I was feeling under the weather and asked if he could sub for one of our weekend mechanics the next day. My day off was spent making calls, and it did not actually take long. Lloyd's last employer was a salvage yard, so I called pretending to look for a job. The owner, Drew, he told me that they were really hurting for staff and to come in that day if I wanted. Well, guys, when I went in, I apologized to Drew for lying, but explained to him the situation with my father and asked what he could tell me about Lloyd. He practically winced when I mentioned the name. As it turns out, Lloyd was fired from the salvage yard and would not, he was fired for stealing. Not only that, but Drew was pretty sure this wasn't the first time because he would look into it and found out that all of Lloyd's references were fake. When I showed Drew the picture of Lloyd's references I'd taken on my phone, he went through Lloyd's paperwork and found the number Lloyd listed for the salvage yard and the emergency contacts. The Drew that Benny talked to when hiring Lloyd was actually Lloyd's mother. I asked Drew if he would please call Benny and tell him all of this. Well, he did. And Benny looked on his work computer to verify the number Drew called him from was actually the salvage yard. Still, Benny was not entirely convinced. Partly because he had caught my dad on video, and partly because he now knew that I would lie to get the day off. I'll admit it never occurred to me the part of the plan might look bad on me. Still, Drew put the phone on speaker and I begged for a chance to prove my dad's innocence. Well, Benny agreed, but he said that he needed to have some real proof before I left the yard. Well, Drew agreed to take my dad on until things were resolved, so even if I can't prove my dad's innocence, at least he'll have a job. Drew also said before I left that we might have caught Lloyd as quickly as if he did the shop investing in some cameras. You know, that gave me an idea. I called Rashad after I got home and he agreed to help. It's gonna take a while and I don't want to be too specific in case anyone from the shop stumbles upon this, but I will update you. Update number 4. Guys, I just want to say thank goodness. It only took me a few days to update and I was really worried that the more tools would go missing in the time it took to follow. But I got lucky. After making my last update, I left the house while there was still some daylight and picked up a bunch of small cameras from the store. The next morning, I got to the shop early. I hid the cameras around the garage. When people started arriving, I waited until Lloyd was there and made sure that he saw me asking Benny to speak with him alone. I was just informing Benny about the cameras, but I made a show of looking angry when I walked back into the garage later. On my lunch break, I called Rashad on speakerphone. This was something Rashad knew was coming, and I did my best to sound angry and scared, telling Rashad that his father had threatened to fire me if anything else went missing, and asking him if he could talk to Benny on my behalf. As planned, Rashad told me there was nothing he could do, and I just have had to hope nothing disappeared. Naturally, I caught Lloyd listening when I hung up the phone. After that day, I went about my business per usual. I would occasionally scan to see if any of the tools were missing, but nothing was. By the end of the day, I was worried that Lloyd might be on to me. Well, the next day, though, I knew I had him where I wanted when he waited an hour after I took my break to take his. He didn't usually wait that long, so I figured he was up to something. When I noticed after he went on break they were missing a hydraulic impact wrench in a Slim Jim, I knew exactly what Lloyd planned on doing. I went to tell Benny immediately, and he said that if my theory was correct, he would react when the time came. Well, it didn't take long, guys. When Lloyd got back from break, he made a huge show of noticing the hydraulic wrench was gone, then stormed off to tell Benny. When they came out of the garage, I could tell that the least part of Benny was now convinced I was telling the truth, because the way he tore into me was too over the top to be real. But we made a show fight, and Benny demanded to check my car. As soon as we got close to the car, I knew I was right about Lloyd using the Slim Jim to break into it. I also realized how quickly we took it to Lloyd a day to do anything after my call to Rashad. Benny found a blanket in the back seat, loosely covering the tools that had previously gone missing. Lloyd really went overboard in trying to set me up. It was almost comical. He clearly thought it was funny because he laughed as he put his hand out for a shake and said, "I guess this is goodbye." Well, his face had dropped when Benny told us both to come back to the office, specifically telling me to bring the camera. They showed everything from every angle. Not only was he shown taking the wrench and the Slim Jim, but one was angled out so that it showed him planting all the tools in my car. Lloyd was shocked, and he audibly asked himself why he had not thought to plant more cameras when he was doing things to my dad. Between the evidence and Lloyd's accidental confession, he was done. Benny not only fired him, but called the police. When they were taking Lloyd away, Benny promised that, he'd make sure Drew testified in court. Needless to say, Dad was hired back the next day. Drew was sad to see him go, but he promised Father and me both that we would always have a place there if we or anyone else we knew needed one. And you want to know the best part? Dad got a raise from Benny. I think it's just because he didn't want my father to sue for wrongful termination, which my dad would do anyways. But it's still a good thing. He's decided not to move back into the house where the owner would not work with him when he needed it. But until he finds a better place, he's welcoming to stay with me and Tara for as long as he wants. I'm just happy to see him happy.